Hi, this is Eric Hess with the Encrypted Economy. What truly gave birth to Bitcoin and the vibrant digital asset economy we have today was a deep distrust of governments, corporations, the faceless organizations, and the need for privacy that could be enforced with cryptography. It was a belief that privacy was part of a social contract, and fundamentally, that people must come together and deploy encryption for common good. This predates Bitcoin and goes right to the heart of protecting privacy with encrypted systems. In this way, the Cypherpunks and the Anarchists were combined, united by distrust, common good, social contracts. Do these themes resonate in the encrypted economy today? Should they? And what's going to become of the encrypted economy, not the podcast, but the economy, if they do not? There is a tension building between decentralized government and what it's supposed to achieve, and cryptonomics. Is power from the governance structures that we are creating going to be reconcentrated? I'm going to caution my listeners here against reading a bias into the way that I frame this question. There does not have to be just one victor or one system in the new economy, but we do increasingly have to ask ourselves whether we are building a better tomorrow for the innovators, builders, and creators, or are we facilitating a new means of control for the next Facebook or the next Google, or even countries engaged in censorship? Let's face it, the flowering of creative energy that we have witnessed in this new economy would not have been possible if it was dominated initially by just a handful of large players or a large country. Some might liken it to the Wild West, but that term masks all the incredible innovation that's actually going on. Common good, social contract, and their relationship with decentralized governance. This is what we discuss with Nathan Schneider today on the Encrypted Economy. In addition to being a professor at the University of Colorado, he is an author and a well-known commentator to the Twitter community. He regularly collaborates with thought leaders in the space on issues of decentralized governance and, of course, cooperatives. I think you're going to enjoy this episode a lot. And with that, I give you Nathan Schneider. Welcome to the Encrypted Economy, a weekly podcast featuring discussions exploring the business, laws, regulation, security, and technologies relating to digital assets and data. I am Eric Hess, founder of Hess Legal Counsel. I've spent decades representing regulated exchanges, broker-dealers, investment advisors, and all manner of fintech companies for all things touching electronic trading with a focus on new and developing technologies. This is Eric Hess with the Encrypted Economy. Today, we are fortunate to have Nathan Schneider on the podcast. Now, Nathan is a professor at the University of Colorado. He is an author of Thank You, Anarchy, Occupy Wall Street. He is also been heavily involved in writing papers and the discussion around decentralized governance and, of course, cooperatives. Nathan, welcome.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
Great to have you on. So I told you I was going to comment on your backdrop, which is, if you're watching the video, we have quite the art gallery back there. Are there any plans to convert those into NFTs and sell them on OpenSea?
Some of them actually are NFTs, not these, I think, in particular, but my kids have minted some NFTs. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Have they? Are they up there with the Beeple auctions or no?
Not yet. Not yet. I figured out minting. I haven't figured out marketing.
Yeah, I think anybody, a lot of us would be in that category.
The ethics of marketing one's children's art, makes one feel icky about the whole process. So it kind of drains the motivation. But we're waiting for some family members to jump on board.
Pseudonymity as a remedy for exploitation of children. So anyway,
all proceeds go to the education of the artists.
There you go. I like that. It goes right into their 529. So Nathan, why don't you give us a little bit of background? I spoke a little bit about your professorship and your works, but maybe give us a little bit of background as to your origin story into the governance universe.
Yeah, well, you mentioned that I wrote a book about Occupy Wall Street. For a while I was really a social movement reporter, so I was covering protest movements around the world, and started a website that's doing that. And the year 2011 was really important for me in that work. It was a year of global uprisings from the Arab Spring to Occupy Wall Street, and there was all kinds of things that these were against, but one of the things that was a common pattern from the Middle East to the U.S. and around the world was the practice of kind of new forms of radical democracy in the streets and in the occupied spaces. And it was striking to me that year that it felt like there was a craving for deeper kinds of democracy among these young people involved in these movements. Wherever you went, it seemed like our digital networks had kind of awakened this craving. And then after the encampments had been cleared and so forth, I was on the lookout for what's going to be next for this craving. Where can this go? Where can this kind of quest for a truer, more real democracy go? And two different traditions or two different currents kind of grabbed me. One was I followed a lot of those activists from the Occupy movement into the cooperative business tradition, a long tradition of business in which the participants own and govern where they work or where they shop or whatever it is. It's a tradition that crosses a lot of political lines. It's a tradition that has expressed itself different ways around the world, but it just became really fascinating to me, particularly its relevance to the digital world. Then at the same time, while I was on my book tour for the Occupy book, a friend took me aside when I was on my San Francisco stop and said, you really need to know about this new thing that just came out. And it was the Ethereum white paper. And, I'd encountered Bitcoin and things like that during Occupy, actually, and I wasn't really that attracted to it. But Ethereum opened the door for something else, which was, maybe we can put these experiments in democracy into smart contracts, into how we build organizations on our networks. And so in the years since, I've been kind of following these two threads, the cooperative business movement, which I wrote a book about, Everything for Everyone, been very involved in helping to develop a new generation of cooperatives, but also the crypto thread, which I think is really coming of age. Right now is the moment, this last year or two, when the DAO, these organizations, these questions of governance are really becoming real. And so it has been a kind of thrilling time to pick up that thread and see also what it has to do with and where it might diverge from that cooperative movement tradition as well.
Excellent. Well, that's a great introduction. And I typically ask about a personal experience, although I almost feel like you shared that personal experience. So unless you had one that you'd prepared, like a personal experience that like a singular experience that shaped your views, like that moment where something just totally clicked for you.
Well, there have been a number of these moments, and some of them have been kind of, maybe I'll contrast that moment of optimism and hope with moments of kind of the kind of downers. Early on in this, I was living in New York in 2014. I would hang around at the Bitcoin Center down on Wall Street, and saw a side of this phenomenon that I at least found a lot less interesting than what kind of first drew me into Ethereum was this. There was this dead miner sitting there in the room, this mining machine that was no longer useful because it wasn't competitive on the network anymore. This way in which there was this kind of dead weight being accumulated, this kind of this empty churning of math, this kind of way in which, by putting the Bitcoin Center in Wall Street, was kind of positioning it as the next generation of this kind of financial sector that had really ruined the financial fortunes of my generation in 2008. And so, as somebody who kind of grown up and being very suspicious of a world in which finance runs our lives more than human needs. I saw in that place an image of a crypto future that I don't think I want, and it poses that question of to me, so often what you hear is the question of whether blockchain or Bitcoin or whatever is going to be real or is going to have value, is going to change the world. To me, the question has really always not so much been whether. In some way, I think it's going to matter. The question is much more urgent of how. How is this going to change the world? Which pathways are we going to take with this technology? The technology does not predetermine those pathways, we do. What are we going to choose to build with this, and what possibilities are we going to ignore?
Yeah, that is a sharp contrast, and I want to get more into the decentralized governance and DAOs, but before I do so, I want to actually go back to your book, Thank You, Anarchy, because anarchy or anarchism, which is different, is really it was part of the Cypherpunk movement toward crypto initially. It was very much based on that, and I think you would agree that certainly as more money has poured into it and has become more financial, has become less about that movement, and along the way it's lost some of that. Maybe DAOs are a way to sort of retain that, but I want to take a step back and sort of ask a very just sort of go through it. The difference between anarchy and anarchism, could you just define that for us?
Well, that way of defining that that people often use is anarchy as kind of a state of kind of madness and chaos, right? And anarchism as this school of thought of people seeking a world without oppression, seeking a world in which coercion is not a major feature, in which violence is not necessary for the functioning of society, and people are able to self-organize more democratically. But I think in some ways the more important distinction for the crypto land is two different threads of what's known as libertarian thinking, under which kind of anarchism falls. Libertarian is a more common term in Europe for the kind of broader picture. And one side is the kind of anarcho-capitalist, which is kind of called but libertarian in the United States, which is a vision in which you have weaker government or no government, but you have very strong property rights. And for instance, both of these sides were there at the beginning of Occupy Wall Street. And these kinds of people, are often interested in the gold standard. So you don't need the government to regulate money. Money is regulated by, the scarcity of gold or something like that. And property is the core ordering principle of society. And then there is a kind of left libertarian view that is more associated with anarchism, which comes out of this tradition, for instance, of Proudhon, and other European figures. Proudhon famously said, "Property is theft." Anarchists for whom property is itself an oppressive relationship, and that it is not, the solution to the problem of oppression, because it requires oppression to function. Ultimately, the Occupy movement really turned much more toward that model and said, what would it look like if instead of, property and coercion, we built a society much more around democratic structuring, as opposed to the response of the kind of Bitcoin and also like the GameStop attack on Wall Street, right? Which is we're going to use property as the means by which to challenge, what we see as oppression. Those are two very different theories of change.
So, anarcho-libertarianism and sort of more left anarchism. Be those two schools?
Yeah. And I think there is, certainly anything in crypto is going to have some kind of property theory. But one dividing line that you see is that people who are more kind of aligned with Bitcoin, for instance, more attracted to it, might be tend to be more of the kind of anarcho-capitalists. They're interested in in a kind of fixed and secure money arrangement, whereas those who are more drawn to Ethereum in some cases, and projects built on it might be more interested. That there's still a property idea, but there's more of a focus on structuring organizations. How do we structure organizations in more creative and appropriate ways? And that is a bit more aligned with that left theory.
Interesting. So, in going back to the Occupy Wall Street, do you think that Occupy Wall Street was reflective of an underlying sentiment? Like you noted that there were like democratic movements, radical democracy all around the world. Or do you think it was more isolated pockets?
Well, we live in a world of subcultures and pockets now, and I think Occupy was part of that. What it did suggest was that those pockets had spread around the world, that there was a kind of networked communication among these movements, where they were transmitting and sharing certain features and ideologies. It wasn't that everybody who came into Occupy was, for instance, an anarchist, but when they got there, they acted in some ways as if they were, because that was the culture that had been transmitted through the networks about how this movement functioned, at least. And so I don't think it's in any way right to claim that this was a necessary zeitgeist, but it was an option put forward, right? This option that was this kind of outpouring that was obsessed with democracy, where people representing these movements I remember one speaker from Eastern Europe speaking before the European Commission, and he makes the speech about how he's not a leader, introducing it as saying, I'm not a leader, we are, we don't need leaders anymore. This kind of, this ambition for a new and deeper kind of political arrangement, the way in which Occupy kind of refused to make demands of the state and of government because it kind of questioned the premise and legitimacy of those institutions to begin with. That was certainly one current. But in the years since, actually, what we've seen is actually globally a rollback of democratic institutions globally. And a decline in according to opinion polls, people's trust and faith in democracy as a way of efficiently organizing a society. So you absolutely can't say that this was that this was a deterministic, expression of the popular will. It was one option. It was one direction. And actually, I would argue the counter direction has been winning out.
Yeah, I think you definitely see elements of that, irrespective of political party. So, I was going to ask you about the Cypherpunk anarchist movement. What has become of it?
I'm not sure exactly how. This is a movement that has been many things to many people, and in some ways has been folded into what has become, the broader crypto world. But it's not entirely, included in it, not entirely encompassed by it. This is a network of people who are inspired by not just the technical features of the internet, but kind of turn some of those features into a social ideology. Into a kind of form of libertarianism in which what we don't need is the government. What we need is, the right technical systems. And you can hear this, when for instance, even someone like Edward Snowden talks. He is very interested in how to build the right technical systems to solve social problems. And this movement, is contributed a lot in the sense of enabling and pushing for, certain kinds of civil liberties and rights to privacy and encryption technologies. But at the same time, I think this movement runs into a real danger in which it searches for a kind of technological fix to problems that I think are better thought of as political. And often this movement has sought to actually eclipse political problems, to do away with politics and to simply turn our social questions into technological ones. I think that's a troubling turn, and it's one that has become in many respects very mainstream in cultures surrounding technology and even business.
And so before we get into it, because we're going to talk more about politics and crypto economics on this podcast, define what you mean by politics.
So for the purposes of the argument I've been developing here, I think of politics as as speech and debate and decision making around some sense of the common good. And in some sense of how our particular good fits into that. But here I draw from the philosopher Hannah Arendt in her account of kind of classical Athens, and she paints a picture of this world in which politics was thought of as apart from the economy. If you entered politics in a state of need, if you weren't a landholder with slaves and all these sorts of things, you were maybe suspect because you might be pursuing your private good. And the political is the space for us to talk about what really matters, what matters to us in ways that aren't capturable in economics. And I use this kind of straw man version of politics, to contrast it to a vision that I think has become increasingly common, particularly around the design of crypto systems, in which economics becomes the means by which most social life and decision making occurs.
Right, and by common good or the greater good, I read your paper and I wanted to tease this one out because it occurred to me, there is the charitable or the societal component writ large, but that's not even what you're necessarily talking about. It can encompass that, but not necessarily, meaning in the context of any group that forms, that common good could be anything that elevates the group as a whole, that could theoretically be economic, but it actually extends beyond economics to things like your ability to be heard, your ability to influence outcomes that better all the participants in the group. Is that the appropriate differentiation when you talk about sort of the common good?
Well, our understanding of what we mean by the common good is always shifting, and it's incredibly complex, and it has to do with being able to negotiate multiple value systems simultaneously, right? So what we might mean by the common good, should have to do with, environmental stewardship. It should have to do with a sense of dignity. A lot of people, for instance, complain that, other people are quote unquote voting against their interests. But often what that's a certain kind of economic logic. Usually, you people would be getting a lot more welfare checks or something if you voted for the other party. But, often what people are in fact voting for is, a sense of dignity, a sense of, they're voting for someone who they think respects them. That sense of respect is something that people care about and that is part of, political deliberations, a respect for culture, a respect for immaterial things that people feel are important. These are all, the kinds of things that fit into the common good. And the issue with the common good is it requires that kind of meta thinking. It's not something that is just a metric that you're trying to maximize. It is that question of what metrics do we care about and how do we want to measure them, and what kind, how are we going to adjudicate the potential conflicts among the different things we care about. So it's an intentionally fuzzy term because it's a fuzzy process, and yet I argue it's a very important one that we would, whereas a more kind of cypherpunk logic and kind of anarcho-capitalist logic might be inclined to say, oh, that's just private. Let's not worry about that. Let's focus on the economic metrics. I would argue that no, actually, these things really matter. And I would argue that the economic should be subsidiary to our ability to reason about the common good.
Right. And certainly it would be dependent on the project as well. So,
Yeah.
it goes to the fundamental mission statement, I guess, or the mission of the project and the values of that project.
Sure. And for instance, I wouldn't say that you need this kind of political reasoning to occur at every area of society, right? You could have, part of the logic of that old, kind of liberal democratic project is, you have a political system so that the economy doesn't have, the level of each individual business can just pursue its business goals. And the political system is supposed to take care of, adjudicating the common good. It enables business to focus on being business. I think, what in terms of the ways of bringing this kind of politics into crypto systems, it doesn't have to happen at every level. The question for me is, how can we make sure it happens where it needs to happen?
Agreed. It's funny, and my son is older than your kids. His artwork doesn't resemble those anymore, but we do have discussions about these things. And when we talk about game systems or like metaverse, without using the term metaverse, because metaverse can mean a number of different things, we talk about purchasing NFTs or the economics that is infusing its way into some of these gaming universes. And his point is, he says on some of the channels I'm talking to, people don't necessarily want it to be economically driven. They kind of what sort of comes out and talking to him, and he obviously doesn't represent the entire universe, but of gamers, but it's a different vision of what a gaming environment should be. And arguably, if you think about it, a gaming metaverse, if we would, and I'm using it for lack of a better term, that would be an area where values and mission are really important, because, everybody knows that Vitalik's, opposition to centralization started when he was playing World of Warcraft, and something that he thought was inequitable. And so very fundamental, people are investing their time, people are investing a lot into these gaming systems, and we can say, oh, they're that's just entertainment. But for many of them, it's a part of their life. It's something that it's their social interaction. It's a development tool. As parents, we can say not too much time on it, but it still has that level of importance. And I wouldn't say it's to minimize. I don't think it minimizes the importance of this common good. It is a forum for interaction, and in that environment, just as a way of example, mission and values are really important to all the people who are participating in this ecosystem or the system.
And it's striking that the thing that makes NFTs take off, right, is that most like kind of incomprehensible human activity of art, right? The stuff that it's the stuff that is not just another financial product that brings new people into this ecosystem, and this is all over the place. I mean, for instance, it goes back to the old anthropology of the gift, Marcel Mauss. This old idea that if a gift, if you give me a gift and I pay you back, the market value of that gift, it's not a gift anymore. You take that as an insult, whereas of course, like, if I, don't send you a thank you note, it feels like something is missing. There is of course reciprocity. There is of course an economy, but there is also this sense in which we value things in a way that that is not reducible to the economy per se, that is not reducible to a number of tokens or a market value per se, and that some of those things are really, really important. Games, art, all sorts of aspects of our lives, including the questions that are kind of unpredictable, are the kinds of things that we need to be able to adjudicate without simply being kind of slave to economic metrics. And again, this is goes back to, the impulse of, at least in the United States, that uprising in 2011, which was this feeling that the economic system acting as this robot, in the housing crisis of that year in 2008 had decimated the lives of many thousands of people, even millions, and it had done that because we were just following the rules, and just by and we couldn't, and the political system was unable to kind of put a brake on that, and to and it was more attached to protecting the system of value than it was to protecting the lives and livelihoods of people. And I think that's kind of what motivated that 2011 outpouring of kind of demand for deeper democracy. And again, when that was frustrated, I think it was a deeply demoralizing moment. And I guess I'm still kind of stuck on that. I'm still kind of stuck on the fact that if we care about democracy in some form or another, we need to keep advancing this. We need to keep use the opportunities of new tools to advance the democratic project, advance that project of healthy politics, rather than kind of give up on it.
I'm going to refer to a paper that you're in the process of writing. It's actually, I noticed you published a draft online, or not published, but you are sharing the draft online. Crypto Economics, Limitation on Governance. And in that paper, you had a quote. It said, following Hayek, designers of blockchain systems based on crypto economics assume economics as a sufficient basis for organizing much of society, as opposed to the account of Carl Polanyi. Did I pronounce that right? Polanyi. Did you?
That's a kind of famous debate, right? About whether politics or economics is kind of prior. Right. And Hayek, who is a kind of source of inspiration for, these are both kind of mid 20th century economic thinkers, right, who both come out of the experience of World War II with particular conclusions. Right. And Hayek comes out saying, look, we can't trust these systems of states and this top down control. The decentralized market is the solution. We have to stop giving up, or we have to give up on this conception of the common good, make the state as minimal as possible, and let the market take care of things. And this is, a theory that you see, pretty rampant in, among enthusiasts of cryptocurrency for some obvious reasons. Polanyi's argument, rather, is that, no, the economy has always and will always be predicated on political structures. You need a law in order to have property, and how you write that law determines how that property works and how those markets work. And so you can't sidestep the question of how you do that. If you do, you're going to wind up with something worse. And I guess I'm siding with Polanyi in these debates, unpopularly in the crypto world.
And what does it? And I agree that in the crypto world, the Hayek, you hear more about Hayek than you hear about Polanyi. How do you draw that interest, particularly in a very noisy crypto system that is based on this notion of politics first? I mean, some people might argue that, hey, don't we kind of have this in, some of our centralized social media companies today where, we don't obviously all have a vote, but we all, we are able to express our views publicly and engage in debate. So what's on how, how does it look in a decentralized Polanyi system?
Well, there are a few different levels, right? And a kind of, in some ways, a kind of easiest, go-to answer is to say, oh, maybe you need just state regulation, right? And, I think one example that has been quite successful has been, the Securities and Exchange Commission introducing this idea of sufficient decentralization, kind of pushing lots of projects toward more decentralized ownership, just by saying, you're going to have a real regulatory headache if you don't. So that's one approach. But I'm personally, as much as I, kind of am not a kind of detractor of the state in general, I am, I think it's kind of a failure of imagination. And I think that reasoning about what is in the kind of a collective interest is something that we can actually explore in the design of these networks themselves, and that we should. For instance, what if a rule like requiring sufficient decentralization were obligatory to use the Ethereum network? What if it kind of self-enforced a rule like that to push projects, tokens running on it toward certain kinds of behaviors? What if it had a regulatory role? Or maybe it would be something across networks. We're starting to see more interchain activity happening. Maybe there are certain kind of agreements that chains need to make, or processes by which they decide those agreements. Another approach too is to build it into the processes of governance. And here we see this stuff happening, particularly at kind of medium-sized scales, right? Where you see projects like the cooperative movement, which was all about trying to find a balance between the economic and the human interests. We're seeing people employing voting systems like quadratic voting, or like conviction voting, where yes, those with more tokens have potentially more power, but it can be counteracted by large numbers or high commitment votes from people with fewer tokens, right? So there's a balance, an attempt at balance that we're seeing projects work toward. Another example is in a DAO called One Hive, which is also spinning off like its model as a kind of replicable thing called Gardens. And here they have a kind of constitution layer where they embed in the constitution certain values that they want to hold. And then the judicial system, which is an economically incentivized judicial system, enforces that constitution. So people can actually get paid to catch others in the act of violating the collective values. These are things that create space in which the economy becomes accountable to something other than just the maximization of token X, where instead you have space, even fundamental space at the base layer of the project, in which you can attest to non-material ambitions and shared values that then the economy becomes responsible to. It's that kind of opening that I think we need to create. And I'm not alone. What I found in the process of working on that paper is what began as just a critique of crypto economic thinking actually turned into a recognition that people are finding the need to insert these kinds of mechanisms into their systems already, and that this is a space of tremendous creativity. And it's I find very exciting to see the clever ways in which people are devising systems that in some ways the world has never seen. In some ways they're very familiar. We've had constitutions before, but doing it quite this way is very new. And that to me is thrilling to be a part of. And and again, to me is a kind of sign of hope for the democratic imagination, to say that we are able to not only defend centuries-old democratic institutions, but actually we are creative enough to build new kinds of systems that really reflect the kind of accountability we feel we need. That kind of activity right now is what has me so excited.
And even on protocols or in systems that are based on crypto economics, you're also seeing with these donor grant pools and fee-funded treasuries where there's people are making proposals for things that are not purely based on crypto economics and being granted them. So clearly, even within the crypto economic focus communities, there's an acknowledgement and a desire to actually do more to actually benefit the world, or to benefit the common good, than simply filling people's bags.
Now, I think that's exactly right. And when I was kind of discussing this with a crypto economic designer who I know, I said, there are some respects in which you may be in some ways transcending the economic with the economic, right? Where you figure out something clever enough to do with economics that you're actually getting us into a space where we're no longer, kind of slave to economics. And he said, that is, if I'm doing that, that's the greatest compliment I could hear. And that to me was a really, reflected something I heard in a lot of these systems as well, where, also I would go, I mentioned One Hive earlier, in my first version of this ongoing, evolving paper, I looked at their material, their website, hung around in their forums for a while. And it felt to me like this is a community totally obsessed with its tokens and with like financial stuff. And then, and I kind of shared a draft with, that kind of made that assessment. And the reaction to that from people in that community was really visceral. No, we're all about values and like, common goals and like social goods. We don't care about the token price at all. And, I don't know if that's true or what it would mean if it were true or whatever. But it was striking to me that their understanding of what they're doing was different from my perception of the kind of token charts and prices and everything that was presented, front and center. And that to me is, again, another indication of this sense in which people are, we can't get away from being human beings, and people are are already recognizing in these systems built out of economics that, that it's not just about that economics. And it's that kind of impulse that, I feel the urge to protect, because I think there really is a danger in a lot of these system designs of, eclipsing every part of us that is not, an economically incentivized creature.
Yeah, and I think you do see that. I mean, if you hang around Discord channels and Telegram groups long enough, and you read what people are commenting on, those who are engaging a lot, they are quickly moving away from a purely crypto economic discussion. If they live and breathe it, they're thinking much more expansively generally. They have political views. They have views on, power structures and much broader and common good too. So it's, I think for those who participate in it less, that maybe spend 5 minutes on crypto a day, they're probably more focused on crypto economics because they're like, what trade do I have to make? What's popping, what's not? But those who are making crypto and digital assets more of a focal point for their across their day, they're actually thinking more broadly, because this may be their sole outlet to do so, and they may not want to view themselves as purely an economic creature.
Yeah. And I've seen this transition happen over time, right? Where when I first got into it, in the about 7 years ago or something like that, it was striking to see like a bunch of computer programmers suddenly learning monetary theory, right? And and that was striking because like usually before that, computer programmers didn't learn monetary theory. It was a different discipline. And suddenly, because of this, Bitcoin thing, they were all like obsessed with inflation and whatever. And that was, really interesting to see. And then, in the 2017 boom, it was like more like all these computer programmers are interested in like financial instruments. And suddenly, like, you saw more of this before because, programmers are getting hired by banks, but suddenly, like all the discussions on Hacker News are about derivatives or whatever. And because the tool is there and it becomes this thing to play with. And in some respects, what I'm excited about and what I'm hopeful, this community is turning toward is this, interest in politics, not in the sense of like Democrats and Republicans or whatever, but politics in the sense of, how do we order a good society? Because that is what they're doing. And that's, I hope it is. And it's what these tools are now getting to the point of enabling. You mentioned earlier the kind of failures of Web 2. And I think, one of those deep failures, one that has been kind of claimed by, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, increasingly over the years, is that they, really, it was a governance failure that has produced such kind of misery and failures of all kinds in these businesses. It's still not really a business failure. Facebook's doing great from an economic point of view, but there's this growing recognition that it is incapable of being responsive to the kind of intangible values that we would expect of a media utility of its sort. And I hope that kind of failure is a reminder to to people building the next wave of systems that we need to get obsessed with questions of governance and power and understand how we're going to capture and enable those essential kind of decision-making processes and debates and actions about the common good in these emerging technologies.
So does politics and crypto projects mean, I spoke before about the mission statement and the values. Does it mean the establishment of those fundamentals, or is that, is it something that evolves over time? How does that actually develop? And I think it sort of goes back to that distinction between Hayek and Polanyi. I'll get it right but that distinction as to when it occurs in the life cycle of one of these projects. Is it something that you would anticipate that could develop over time, like even if it doesn't have that focus initially, or do you think it really needs to be the underlying basis for organizing to begin with?
Well, I think both in some respects. I mean, I think there's one respect in which maybe individual projects don't have to worry about this too much, but maybe it's something at the infrastructure layers that we really want to focus on, right? As we're seeing like a bunch of different chains emerging around doing smart contracts, Ethereum, Solana, and these sorts of things, they're largely they're playing a game of efficiency right now. They're trying to, they're worried about throughput and stuff like that. But, I think at some point, those kinds of, those level, those types of projects might need to, worry about kind of something closer to legislation. And maybe they're competing on those things. Maybe you have different regimes that you can move among, and you have some competition around governance. In another another context, you could see it happening temporally. So maybe a project begins, as something that's closely held. And, this is along the lines of this concept I've been using of exit to community, which is a kind of narrative in which projects might begin closely held, and then they gradually, it's also called progressive decentralization in crypto land. They gradually become more accountable to stakeholders. And maybe in that process, they develop, more political capacities, if that seems like the appropriate thing to be doing for that kind of project. So I think there's a lot of ways to do this. My call is mainly for for us to turn from that level of experimentation in, weird financial instruments and really embrace what's already beginning to happen, which is a kind of civilization, civilizational level of experimentation in governance and in political systems that that we'll need to make these systems accountable the way we need them to be. And again, when I compare this to to stuff going on in a lot of our governments around the world, or to even cooperative business, which is supposed to be doing kind of democratic business, people in the crypto world are doing much more creative experiment, at least at the level of mechanism design, not so much at the level of, diversity and inclusion, for instance, but certainly in the design of technical mechanisms that might capture, a sense of the political environment better than, what we've ever used in history. So.
Right. I was going to say on diversity and inclusion, I think that's a whole different question, because certainly from its design, it certainly doesn't make any distinction, but in its effect, like how I'm not even sure how you scale that one, but maybe that's another podcast at a different date. I think we first get to politics. I mean, it certainly is blind, but in terms of outreach, you definitely see pockets developing that are actually trying to be more inclusive, by just in the outreach and thinking about how the community is built.
I think these things are connected, right? In the sense that I think of diversity and inclusion here, not just in the sense of like, are we, we white guys who are, involved in this world, like being welcoming or something, but really like, is the system set up to care about, for instance, poverty? Is it set up to care about, workers' rights, or human rights? And I've been in this scene long enough to have seen cycle after cycle of people saying this is all about liberating the unbanked. This is all about, like all these kinds of ambitious social goals. But when it comes down to it, it's often a bunch of people with considerable privilege accessing markets that enable them to get even more wealth and power. And they don't have a tremendous incentive, the way these systems are designed, to actually follow through on those claims. And so one of the things that I think comes in when you start exploring the political side, when you're not just accountable to how you measure money, is what would it look like to create systems that are forced to be accountable to people who don't have economic power. That's something these systems really have not done yet.
Interesting. I'm going to circle back to Web 2.0 and Web 3.0 for a moment. I think we all have a vision of how Web 3.0 does facilitate decentralization. But let's just sort of walk through, how do you envision Web 3.0 actually decentralizing concentrated power structures?
I think this is a really important question, and it to me it goes back to the it's a cycle that we've seen repeated a few times in the history of the internet. I have an article on this called "Decentralization and Incomplete Ambition." If you're into downloading paywalled academic articles, but it's something we've seen over and over. The ambition for decentralization started in internet land as a Cold War ambition to make networks funded by the Pentagon more resilient to nuclear attack, right? It was purely a technical means to an end. And then it becomes a kind of end in itself as people start designing systems in this sort of way. And then with the rise of the web, the kind of Web 1.0, Tim Berners-Lee has this idea that, still by 1999 in his memoir at the time, that the technical design of the web is so decentralized that no company can capture it. Of course, 20 years later, he is completely consumed with trying to challenge the capture of his invention by a few powerful companies. And of course, Web 2.0 does this with a kind of power that not only centralization of corporate power, but actually the production of companies with centralized power that the world has never seen before. Not only has this decentralized network failed to prevent centralization, it has actually enabled more centralization than was ever possible before. And I actually think we face a similar danger with Web3. I am under no impression that decentralized technology produces decentralized political, economic, et cetera, outcomes. It's perfectly possible that Facebook could use this technology by making it much more user-friendly and leverage this into a market play that dramatically expands its market and its power. Or that the Chinese government could use this kind of technology to create a kind of surveilled economy of a sort the world has never seen. It seems to me very likely that if we continue having faith that decentralized technology is going to produce decentralized outcomes, we are going to end up with something worse than what we presently have. Which is why I argue in that piece that we need to think about what I call accountable centralization, to actually plan, if you really want decentralization, plan for centralization, and accountable centralization where you need it. And an example of that that I think is worth considering is antitrust law. Antitrust law is a system designed to protect a decentralized market by ensuring that you have a centralized authority that's powerful enough, at least in theory, to constrain the ability of other centralized actors to emerge. And so I think the pursuit of decentralization, and nothing else, is going to, risks that danger. And if you are going to build those intentional centralized authorities, that again is a political challenge. How do you make sure that that thing is really accountable the way you need it to be? Economics alone won't do it. You need it to be accountable to something other than just whoever has the most tokens.
And so what would be best positioned to actually be that central authority to ensure centralization?
I hope that it's not any one thing. I hope that we are building topologies, right? Where we have decentralization where we need it, and we have certain centralized entities where we need it. But for instance, you could imagine, one example of this is the role the SEC is playing in the crypto world right now. It is carrying this big stick and saying, you better actually be decentralizing control of your systems. And that is, a very meaningful role, but I don't want it to be the only role, but maybe in the context of networks that are forming, of layer one networks, maybe it's something that, maybe it's actually a kind of governance as a service that different projects are subscribing to. I think it can take a lot of different forms, but some kind of authority structure that is able to counteract emergent centralized power that could be dangerous to the system is going to be necessary. So if you're developing, a layer one protocol, it might be something worth thinking about, and it's something that projects have thought about. You think of something like the Ethereum Foundation or other foundations. It's not like these are dictatorial bodies with the ability to control the whole system, but they have a certain amount of centralized power. And to me, the question is, how can we make sure that those are accountable to the right people, in the right kinds of ways? So how do you make sure that when you do create a kind of centralized authority that can help counteract, emergent threats, that it is that it has the system's shared, in a sense, the system's common good at heart, rather than being capturable.
I can't help but think about the metaverse as being an area where this all plays out. And again, I'm sorry to use the term metaverse. I actually hate the metaverse now more because I don't like using the term meta anymore, because I feel like it's like I have to doff my cap to Facebook. So people call it the hyperverse or anything but the metaverse. But this concept of, of a more immersive experience that, I guess that's facilitated by Web3 and the ability to bring wallets and identification and even potentially digital assets. Participants in these communities will probably look to understand the value system. Do you see like that as being a primary area where politics really starts to play out more? I talked about it in the context of gaming before, and that's just sort of one aspect of it. But do you see that as like, sometimes you hear about the creation of crypto nation states, right? Like this sort of aspirational, like, can we create a common people that is sort of organized along, that's not organized within the conventional, traditional power structures, but organized across interests and such. And in order to do so, you have it economically, but an economic interest alone isn't really going to isn't going to really capture people, to your point, their value systems, what they want to believe in. Like you could have people with, economics alone won't provide that sort of unity or that common goal. And to me, that, again, I'm not even advocating for a nation state because I don't even know, like what do? You say, hey, I'm a nation? Like nobody's United Nations. They're like, no, you're not a nation state. You're like a crypto community, right? But like, is this going to play out in the metaverse or the hyperverse or the forget whatever the next iteration is of these common, more immersive communities?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on the anxiety of using the language and adopting Zuckerberg's prognostications as
we should change. We should every single time he changes the name of his company to pick up on a new trend. We should just wait till he like changes all his trademarks and gets completely invested, and then just change it again.
Yeah, well,
nobody uses Meta. Like Meta, who uses Meta? That's crazy. What does that mean? Metadata? I don't know. Anyway,
yeah, he changes his mind every few years. It was private groups, and then it became private chat, and then it became metaverse. But I mean, I think one way or another, we're seeing a phenomenon where the possibility of power structures emerging that that in some ways replace some of the functions of the nation state are coming. I mean, they're already there in the sense that corporations do that in a lot of ways, and with internet technologies, we have the option to create, alternatives to that. We have the ability to create transnational, transterritorial entities. I think states are, territorial states are still going to be important in terms of the things that matter in territorial places, like the local library and the roads and bridges, and, maybe, some version of, defense and other sorts of stuff. But if you're into that sort of thing, but I do think that there is another layer that's forming, and I do think this is an opportunity to say, do we want this layer to be like better or worse than the last one? Do we want it to be like, this kind of sci-fi dystopia, or do we want it to be a kind of nice improvement in which we have to worry about less horrible stuff, and where more people get to live in a way that where they get to focus on things that actually matter in their lives, and I think there is really that opportunity, but it requires systems that are able to listen to what people actually think matters in their lives, and so I hope we see this as a kind of constitution making event potentially, right? Not to say that it is a total removal of all systems that have preceded it, but in some respects what we're involved in is the making of a new kind of constitution of the kind of political and social life that is going to come, and for better or worse, the way human beings tend to work is a lot of the rules of a new game get made real quickly and they stick. A lot of things about internet culture, formed in the early 90s when there were 20 people on BBSs, right? And they just stuck, the emoji, all sorts of practices, LOL, and I think we're in a moment of making those, and the kinds of things we're worried about and the kinds of things we're excited about right now are going to have effects that I think could be potentially enormous, and we should take that responsibility seriously.
Oh, great! I don't know a better way to end the episode with that message of imports.
Thank you very much. It has been a fun conversation. I appreciate your generous questions and comments, and it's been really fun.
Awesome. Thank you.